Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Chatfield, and I am the event specialist here at the Institute of Financial Operations. I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar titled Global Trends in Automated Data Capture in Accounts Payable. This webinar is a free training opportunity for the Institute's members, and as always, we're happy to have all of you here with us for today's presentation. If not already a member of the Institute, we certainly encourage you to learn more about the value of our membership by visiting our website at financialops.org. We now offer several membership types, including premium, virtual, student, corporate, and not-for-profit group memberships. Your presenter today is Charles Kaplan, Vice President of Marketing, Brainware Incorporated. Mr. Kaplan oversees Brainware's global marketing organization. His experience includes more than 15 years in information technology and analysis in such areas as product management, revenue management, and financial analysis. Prior to joining Brainware, Kaplan led business development for Decision Path Consulting, where he worked with clients to provide business intelligence and data warehousing assessments and strategies. His experience also includes senior-level product management and marketing roles in data capture market with SER Solutions, in the telecom industry with Second Century Communications, and in the travel industry with American Airlines and Marriott International. Kaplan is a noted speaker on the data capture, presents frequently at IFO events, and has taught professionally for the Data Warehousing Institute. We here at the Institute of Financial Operations are happy to have Charles with us here today to share his expertise in this area. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to you, Charles.
That's great, Kimberly. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out. We hope you've had a chance to download a copy of the survey findings. If you haven't, I'll show you how to do that at the end of today's presentation. But this has been a program that we have now run for 2 years consecutively in conjunction with the Institute. And I think the feedback has been, quite interesting, and so I hope you'll, find that to be the case in today's webinar. Just a little bit about the methodology. We actually conducted the survey in September of this past year. This is the second annual survey that we've done. So the thing that was interesting about this year is I will be able to share, some of the changes in the markets, and also in some cases where, generally things have stayed the same. But I've got a little bit of a comparison that we can draw from this year now that we're in our sophomore season. This survey was sent, in fact, many of you may have participated in the survey, but it was sent out to the IFO and IAPP membership and prospect base worldwide. So it went out to quite a significant audience, and I'm really pleased to see that the response to it was quite exceptional. We had more than 550 respondents to the survey, which is right about the same as where we were last year as well. So a significant response, which to me indicates some level of interest in the topic area itself. It was a pretty straightforward survey. There were 25 questions. We did it both here and over in the UK. And so, like I said, if you've got additional questions, I'll reiterate this at the end, but if you've got questions, you can ask them on today's webinar by using the Q&A feature. If you've got questions following the presentation, you're welcome to shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to try and answer them for you. I actually learned this lesson last year. We jump right in and we're talking about automated data capture, but what I find is oftentimes it's worth spending a moment to try and talk a little bit about the topic so that we make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about automated or intelligent data capture. And I bring that up because in the context of AP automation or general automation strategies, there's quite a few different acronyms, buzzwords, and options out there that, you may either be considering or already have deployed. And so, part of the survey centers on how does this type of technology, fit into a technology landscape for AP automation, or if you're looking at it for the first time, what are some important things to consider in terms of the benefits as you're setting up a strategy or trying to understand, if automated or intelligent data capture is something that's worthwhile for your organization. Just to have a little fun, I steal this concept from a noted speaker in the industry, marketing and sales industry, a guy named Jeffrey Gitomer. But he always comes up with X number and a half different points that he likes to make. And so, thinking about it, I think there are probably 8 or 9 at least misconceptions about what automated or intelligent data capture is. And if you've got additional, thoughts on this, I certainly welcome those, because I kind of like to understand, the general market space, and certainly included in the body of work that we do here at Brainware. The first one that, we typically run into is, why would you try and automate something on paper when, in fact, paper is going away? And I think more and more organizations are recognizing that they're able to shift more of their transactions to transactions that are electronic. In their native form are electronic. Certainly helps with a green standard, for organizations, and elimination of the inefficiency of paper. But quite honestly, there's still what I call a long tail. Kind of that last mile around which, it may be impossible for you as an organization to get rid of the paper. And so, when you think about a strategy, it's important to make sure that you think about it in its totality, and adopt technology that can handle all of the transactions. So the first thing is to think about, how much paper do you really have in your organization? Second thing is, is the goal is not simply to enable a workflow. It really is to automate the transaction. And so when we talk about this, and when you look at case studies in the industry of companies that have actually adopted this technology, what you find is they are talking about processing, right? End-to-end processing of a transaction, not merely capturing and keying somewhere downstream. OCR is no longer synonymous with data capture, certainly not with intelligent data capture. So if you've looked at technology like this before, I think what you'll find through case studies is that it's matured significantly. In fact, a lot of folks comment typically that they don't even recognize it, compared to what it used to be, and the benefits that it generates. Vendors always exaggerate, so I don't really believe it works. Well, listen, this is something that I encourage you to, to test with your vendors, because in some cases that's true, and in others it's not. And so I think the best place to typically turn is to your industry peers who have perhaps evaluated and adopted this technology, because again, I think when you do apples to apples comparisons, you find that the reality speaks for itself. Data capture gets some of the information, but I still need to key every document. That's increasingly becoming a false statement. I think more and more information, more and more companies are processing invoices, documents like invoices straight through. So we talk about a straight through or a touchless pass, literally from receipt to post into the ERP system as being the new reality. And when we talk about automated data capture, I think that's the technology that enables that type of process to take place. It's no longer template-based, and so you don't need to worry about what may have been the case previously with OCR-based technologies. The technology, the intelligence in the name really indicates the fact that, there's a lot less setup and there's a lot less maintenance, and so therefore the total cost of owning and maintaining solutions like this has really, really changed dramatically. There's not a compelling ROI. Again, that's part of the business case analysis. You'll see that actually in the data, that many organizations perceive that there's not a compelling business case, or perhaps not the budget or the resources to support. And so, I think as you look a little bit deeper, we find that typically this is a misconception. Number 8 then is, I don't know of any companies that are actually doing this on a large scale. Again, that's something that's shifting in the organization. In fact, what we find is it tends to be the largest organizations in the world that have adopted this technology first. And so we have a disproportionate number of large companies. We've got a little bit of data, behind this as well, but you find that the largest companies in the world are the ones that are actually most actively looking at technology like this and actually implementing it. And then number 8.5 is, listen, all this technology is the same. That's not true. Relates kind of back to one of the earlier points here, which is I think you really need to evaluate it. So what I think often becomes the case is, we kind of get caught in a rat race, and, AP operations, for many organizations we talk to, are under so much pressure to do more with less, with whether it's budget cuts, M&A activity, and the like. It feels like we're kind of going around and around in circles, almost to the point of insanity, and it becomes difficult in my observation, sometimes to, you know, to see the forest for the trees, or even to take time to, you know, kind of pull the proverbial head out of the sand and kind of look around to see what's available. IFO is actually a fantastic organization for help to facilitate, you know, whether it's through conferences, interactions, and educational sessions and so forth like this. But this is really an opportunity to network with your peers, look at the data that's available based on, you know, what a broad base of colleagues in industry are doing, and really establish best practices. And so I think it's a testament to the fact that you're taking time out of your day today to participate in this webinar, to the fact that, you know, I think you're probably thinking about how to look forward and plan for expansion and growth. Where it fits, you know, in terms of the technology landscape is, you know, I think Hackett has done some research around this, if you're familiar with the Hackett group, and more recent studies they've looked at really suggest that OCR has become what we now think of as intelligent data capture, and it's really created a technology to help bridge that gap between an entirely electronic transaction and the benefits that that yields in terms of, you know, general cost, processing time, and efficiency, to, you know, the lower level automated solutions, paper being the perfect example. And so, you know, again, to think about it where it may fit is, you know, as a bridge strategy or as a technology that kind of helps fit into the landscape, I think Hackett does a pretty good job of positioning it. We see the problem as being fairly extensive in that, you know, 80%, 85% by some estimates of the documents that drive business transactions are still paper-based. And so while we're talking about accounts payable today, you know, I think you'll see in the data that organizations are looking at imaging and capture much more broadly. And what we see is a much broader tendency that when organizations adopt it for one type of document, there tends to be an adoption across many different document types as well. But this is kind of the fundamental issue. We asked the question in this year's survey about, you know, how are you, you know, what are the different formats that the invoices come in to your organization. Now, you know, we allowed for different responses in this, but I'm almost surprised myself that you see a disproportionate share of invoices that are being received in paper. This indicates, you know, this is based on the number of respondents, so it doesn't necessarily correlate specifically to the paper-based volumes, but it gives you an indication for the number of companies and how big a presence paper has in the AP department. As far as things like email, EDI, EIPP, and fax, you know, what we're seeing in terms of movement of the data here is EDI is fairly mature. It's, you know, it's good technology for what it does, and many organizations have adopted that. What we're really seeing a shift in is to email as being a way to send invoices. So an increasing number of customers are working with their suppliers to facilitate email receipt of invoices so that they can be processed without having to impose any type of a process change or a new platform on your suppliers. At the end of the day, you know, ultimately what we're talking about is trying to put the data from the invoices into an ERP system quickly, accurately, and at the lowest possible cost, so that it can also not only process the transaction, but be available for things like audit, compliance, even more strategically for things like, you know, better alignment with your procurement department to drive efficient and, you know, better contract through, you know, suppliers with your procurement specialists. And I would really begin, you know, to sort of posit to you that, you know, best practices, certainly the thought leaders in the industry are doing just that. So the need for automated data capture really arises from the fact not only that paper still plays a prevalent role in, you know, in driving AP transactions, but also to the fact that, you know, there are many different layouts of documents. I mean, you know, as a supplier or a customer, I have no control over how my suppliers send their invoices to me in terms of the format. And so, you know, typically the data has been keyed. And, you know, while I think there's always some opportunity for wage arbitrage through outsourcing, offshore, or to lower wage regions, Ultimately, that's not as scalable as looking at technology. And up until more recently, I think the technology didn't really exist to provide a real long-term type of strategy. The automated data capture typically fits, into a supplier spend profile that looks something like this. I mean, on the far left, the green shaded area tends to be the large number of transactions that are received from a relatively small number of suppliers. So if your supplier profile looks something like this, which many do, I think typically the strategies involve, centering on things like EDI or even EIPP for those suppliers that you do a certain volume through. But as I mentioned, there's always tends to be a long end of the tail here, and so oftentimes we look at different ways to try and handle those effectively and efficiently, and invariably many organizations are still left carrying the burden of keying. So that kind of sets the backdrop, and I offer that simply to try and sort of set some premise as to what it is we're talking about today and kind of where that fits. Into the data, before we actually get into the results, give you sort of a geographic breakdown. Just about 80% of the respondents to this year's survey were actually from North America, so businesses that are represented in North America. European businesses at right about 17%, and then you see it also went out to Asia, Africa, South America, and Australia, and there are relatively low volumes in those regions. This profile fits, pretty closely to the IFO member profile, which comes as no surprise. The thing that's interesting, though, while the numbers are still small, we see almost a doubling in those very small regions. So the numbers for North America are about the same, Europe's about the same, but roughly. But for Asia, Africa, South America, and Australia, the numbers are up significantly relative to where they were last year, which I think just, I would expect will continue to change over time. In terms of industry breakdown, we saw a bit of a shift. Sort of the top 3 or 4 industries, are pretty much the same in terms of their, sort of their position. But in terms of healthcare, for example, we saw a big shift up. Last year we had about 14% of the respondents were from the healthcare industry. My observation on this is with, in the U.S. with healthcare reform, the pressures for cost containment, organizations are looking for more and more solutions like this that will help drive efficiency. So the industry respondents, I think there's more, much more interest from the healthcare community. In the banking and financial services sector, represented about 16% of this year's respondents. That's up from 7% last year. So, more than 2 times the respondents, which I think, again, is largely because of the interest in that sector. Retail stayed about the same. Manufacturing, again, is up. That's, the biggest of the industries that tends to, work with the IFO and certainly was interested in the survey. And the others are roughly the same. We asked to get a sense, too, for the size of the companies, and we broke it into the categories that you see here, anything from less than 500 million to more than 10 billion. This is roughly the same as the breakout from last year, no notable shift. The thing that's interesting to point out is 48% of the companies that responded to this year's survey of the 550 were greater than $1 billion. So again, tends to be going to larger organizations, but I think still a pretty good representation across the spectrum. So one of the things that we do in these webinars, and we did it last time, and I like to do this, is actually poll the audience to get your perspective and feedback on some of these statistics that I'll share with you. So there's an interactive polling feature that we use in GoToWebinar, and I will open that up for you. And so you should see on your screen now, the question at the top of the page is asked, how many FTEs does your organization require to key invoice information? And if you use the radio button, any of the 5 radio buttons there, to pick the response that most closely corresponds to your organization, then what we'll do in a moment here, once I get a pretty good representation from the audience, is I will share those poll results with you so that you can see kind of get the demographic profile of your colleagues on the line here. So let me just give you a second. Again, that poll is open. If you'll take a moment and click one of the corresponding radio buttons. I think as Kimberly also pointed out at the beginning that these are interactive webinars, so I encourage you to share your results with your colleagues. I'll wait for just a couple of more votes. Okay. Great. So with that, I will close the poll and share the results. And so, so this is interesting. You can just there we go. So, sort of pretty interesting, breakdown. About a third of you have 1 to 5 folks keying invoice information into your systems. About 40% in that bucket between 6 and 15. We've got a very low number in 16 to 20, but then, about 20%, 21% at more than 20 FTE. So you can see a pretty broad range. We don't actually have the data to correlate this, to the size of your company, but typically this distribution sort of fits with the size of the company as well. Okay. So, so that's interesting. I appreciate that feedback. We've got several other poll questions. So I asked the question here: how many invoices per month does your organization actually process? These are questions that we actually asked in the survey. And so with that, I will also launch this so that you can see it. And again, we break it into 5 buckets. So if you use the radio button to select the appropriate response, we'll get a sense for what the breakdown is across the audience. And then I can share with you what the breakdown is from the survey results as well. So let's just give it a moment here. I appreciate you all taking time to provide your feedback. Wait for just a couple more. Okay. Great. Good. Okay. So we're going to close that poll, which will then publish the results for you. Oh, sorry. How about I share the results with you first? And so when we look at this, this is interesting. So about 26%, less than 5,000 a month. 26%, so even split 5,000 to 10,000 a month. And then we get the remaining 48% are greater than 10,000 a month. So you'll be interested to know, as I'll hide those results, which will take us back to the presentation. When I compare that to actually how the respondents to the survey line up, it's close. Slightly higher, 34, 35% were less than 5,000 from the survey population. Slightly fewer in the 5 to 10,000 range at 18.9%, according to our survey results. But roughly the same overall in terms of greater than 10,000 a month. So pretty similar results. In the 2010 survey, we actually found that 53% were greater than 10,000 invoices a month. So slight shift in the demographic of the participants this year, but not anything significant in terms of this data. A new question that we asked this year, because I think oftentimes this is an area of focus when you're looking at automation strategies, we actually asked how many vendors are in your vendor master file. And so, again, as we looked at this, about 30% have less than 5,000 vendors in the vendor master file. 20%, between 5 and 10,000, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing is, 6%, 6.5% had greater than 80,000 vendors in the vendor master file. So tend to be very large companies. I think what we also tend to find is, through an automation exercise, oftentimes the number of vendors in the vendor master file can be reduced. I think either as part of the process of automation or following the automation initiative simply because you free up the resources to do so, cutting back on that active vendor file can actually, help the organization in terms of efficiency and cost significantly. To get a sense of technologies, we asked the question, this is also a new question this year, as to what ERP systems are you using? About a third of the respondents said SAP, about 40% said Oracle, and keeping in mind that Oracle represents, Oracle EBS and financials, as well as PeopleSoft and JD Edwards, so, sort of several different Oracle platforms there. About 12%, Lawson, which tends to be a little bit more prevalent in the healthcare space, for example. Microsoft, which has a pretty good presence there in terms of ERP. I assume that's, with Dynamics and the like, Great Plains. And then, smaller ERP systems, more specialty systems like Infor, Epicor. We had a bunch that were kind of lumped into custom and proprietary. And then there were, keeping in mind, again, this doesn't sum to 100% if you're trying to add it up. It's because in many organizations there are actually multiple ERP systems. We asked the question, this was the same question as last year, as to what technologies are you using? And so in this case, you can see the comparison to the 2010 data. We looked at, EDI, which remained relatively stable, although up by several percentage points to 47%. 47% of the companies out there actually have some EDI, strategy in place. Back to that, supplier profile picture that I showed you a couple of slides ago, it's not uncommon to be using multiple technologies in combination, to sort of complete the automation strategy. ACH on the payment side, no surprise there. That's mature technology used by, most organizations. Same thing with wire transfers, so pretty relatively stable year over year. EIPP and e-invoicing, or electronic invoicing, actually saw a bump up from last year, up about 3%. The notable difference was the shift in document imaging and scanning. So that was up from 63.6% last year to 73% this year, which is interesting. I think that really speaks to the fact that getting rid of the paper, ideally early in the process, or at least on the back end of the process, provides a tremendous amount of benefit, both in terms of physical storage, but also, audit, compliance, and the likes. Automated data capture, with OCR, relatively stable, and we'll see this, that, despite the fact that, companies are adopting it, it still remains relatively, let's say, either unknown or rather low adoption rate on that. Workflow has gone up slightly, not a surprise, and P-card, remained relatively stable year over year. So the next question, which actually then precedes some data from the survey, was how many days on average does it take your organization to pay the invoices? And this question, I asked this question because it really speaks to cycle time. So I'm going to launch this poll. You'll see it pop up on your screen. If you'll take a moment and participate in the survey, this is the question precisely as it was asked in the study. So 1 to 3 days, 4 to 7 days, 8 to 11 days, 12 to 15 days, or more than 15 days. So we got pretty good responses coming back. I'll leave it open for just a few more moments, and then we'll share some insights and some observations based on the data. Okay, that's great. Got a few more folks coming in. Great, that's good. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. This is interesting to me. This is actually quite a bit different than what we got back from the survey results. But as you can see, the same, very few, about 5% of you processing, in 1 to 3 days, about 25% of the companies in 4 to 7 days, and 16% at 8 to 11, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing is actually 43% of you on the line today actually said that it's more than 15 days on average to pay invoices. So I'm going to hide that, and let's flip over to the results from the study. So you can see it's quite a bit different. Split there, 16%, 1 to 3 days, 30% in 4 to 7, and so on and so forth, with close to 25% saying it's more than 15 days, which is quite a bit different than how you all just responded. The interesting thing is when we look at the data from last year, I see it's sort of an interesting shift. Last year, the numbers in the 1 to 3 days was at about 20% of survey respondents. So we've seen about a 25% decline in the survey respondents in those companies that are paying their invoices in 1 to 3 days. The corresponding shift then is interesting. Over to the 4 to 7 days, over to 8 to 11 days and 12 to 15 days, if we look at those two buckets, the numbers are up by about 33%. So what I read into the data is, there's sort of been a shift from, really quick pay to payment terms that have tended to extend out between 2 and 3 weeks. Just an observation, again, based on the data, and I suspect that may be because of, the time it takes to actually process the transaction through the organization. It may also have to do, with your own working capital strategies. We asked the question, about processing approach. Are you centralized, distributed, or not sure? The data here is roughly the same. We had more participants that actually knew which it was, so don't know went down by several points, but the relative volume between centralized, which is clearly the dominant method, centralized versus distributed, has remained relatively the same. And I would state based on this and other research that a centralized approach to things like AP processing is really a best practices for most organizations. We asked the question, though, that now, following to organizations, are you actually using automated data capture in accounts payable? So I thought this would be another interesting question to ask the audience here, just to sort of get a sense. We'll launch that poll. Very simple answer here, yes or no. And then, based on your respondents, I'll also share with you, what the general market said. So we'll give it just a sense here, and then I'll share those results with you. What I'll also be happy to do while you're filling this in, if you're interested in receiving the presentation, including some of these poll results, I'll be happy to share those with you after today's presentation, and we'll let you know how to get a copy of that just before we wrap up. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close the poll, and I'll share the results for you. And not surprising, about 61% no, not using automated data capture in AP, and close to 40% said yes. When I flip over and we look at the results from the study, not too far off, although 69% of the survey respondents said no, and 31% yes. Yes actually went up. It went up from roughly 29% last year to roughly 31% this year. So just about the same, slightly more though. We then asked the question about use of automated data capture beyond accounts payable. And so what you see here is in the upper left-hand quadrant, that's a representation of respondents who have not deployed automation in AP. And so for them, what you find is it's nearly a 50-50 split between yes and no response. So they're not using it in AP. About 51% are using automated data capture somewhere else, and about 50% aren't. When you poll, or you look more specifically at the data from those that are using automated data capture, is you do find a higher percentage that are using it in other areas as well. So whether one sort of initiates the other, or whether AP, kind of becomes a proving ground for it, that I think is, sort of case-by-case basis. But what I think you find is, some level of correlation of you using it in AP tends to drive higher results outside. We asked this, then the follow-on question is, if you are using it, which document types? So if you're using it in other areas. And again, we broke this down. So in the upper left-hand side, for the respondents that said, no, we're not using it in AP, here's where we're using it, you see. And there are a number of different areas. In the lower right-hand side, we ask the same question for respondents who are using it in AP. And some really interesting things jump out, not the least of which is pretty much across the board, you see much higher levels in these other document types, financial transactions and others. The ones that are particularly striking are for things like checks, maybe just check imaging, for storage, but also check processing. Remittances is up, 50%. Up to 45, in terms of handling. Documents such as EOBs, remittance documents in the healthcare system are up significantly. So companies that have deployed data capture are really using it, in some interesting ways, presumably for areas that are otherwise, very, very manually intensive. So one of the key things, one of the key benefits is actually the cost to process, and many organizations actually measure this, pretty specifically. So we'll open up the poll here and ask you, what is your average cost to process an invoice? And so, take your best guess. I always recognize when we present data like this, I think one of the questions we always seem to get is, well, how exactly do you, what do you include in the cost? Typically, this includes direct cost, I think is the best practice, and then allocated indirect, cost is kind of the best practice for this. So, that's the structure. If you don't know specifically, take your best guess, but I'll share with you as well what the poll results were. Wait just a couple more minutes for the responses to come in. Okay. All right, that's great. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And so, as you can see, the majority of organizations looks like it's somewhere in between $2 and $10 per invoice. So that's a pretty wide gap, I recognize. But about 12% at less than $2 an invoice, which I find as you go out and talk to customers and so forth, that tends to be that's best practice in most industries. 10 to 15 or greater than $15 an invoice, tends to be on the high side, and maybe in a function of the types of invoices you're processing, or it may be a function of the process and the maturity of the technology that you've adopted. So to share with you some of the results back from the study, what you find when you compare in the upper left the respondents to the study who have not deployed automation in AP and kind of what their range of invoice processing costs is with those that have deployed it, there is a significant reduction in the cost per invoice, particularly at those companies that are able to do so for less than $2 per invoice. What you also find is, in the report from the study, none of the companies that responded said that they cost them more than $20 to process an invoice. Whereas you could see, it was about 8% in the companies that have not deployed AP or data capture in AP. About 8%, said it was $20 or greater, and in many cases even greater than $25. So you see a pretty broad distribution here, but a clear correlation to the reduction in cost per invoice that can be accomplished with automated data capture. We have some questions about trends as well. So what are you seeing in terms of processing costs over the last 18 months? This is interesting as well. For the upper left-hand side, you've got about 52%, unchanged. 30%, are somewhat lower, and about 17% higher. When you compare that to the chart on the right, what you see is, about 25% unchanged, but 48% of the respondents have actually achieved lower processing costs in the last 18 months. I find that rather striking. We asked about turnaround times. So how quickly does it take to respond an invoice? And again, this is sort of a trend question. When you look at the data on the left, so again, those companies that have not deployed AP data capture, About 40% of them are processing invoices, more quickly, versus 60.7% of companies that have done so today. I apologize. I made that comment. I was reading off a note that I had made. That was actually last year's data. So 40% faster last year versus about 60% faster this year. We asked about trends in errors. This is one of the benefit areas that we tend to identify when we actually run these studies. When we asked, have you seen the trends in errors, increase, you have more errors or fewer errors by a percentage, up to 1% or more than 1% in either direction. We found about 25.7% reported fewer errors, those companies that had not deployed automation, AP automation with data capture, as opposed to 40.7% that reported fewer errors, those companies that had deployed automated data capture. So in that case, interesting, again, much higher correlation with that data. So another poll question that asks, what do you believe are actually the biggest benefits to using automated data capture, real or perceived? And we'll open this up. And in the actual survey data, I think we had a position in there that says, I don't see any benefit. We've got very few responses in that. And so just to conform to what GoToWebinar allows me to do in the polling questions, I limited it to 5. So go ahead and select one of these. What do you believe is the biggest benefit? And then I'll actually share the results from the survey with you as well. Just a couple of more minutes on this. Again, thank you all for taking the time to interact with today's presentation. Okay, there we go. All right, so we'll close the poll, share the results. The dominant is lowering the cost. Faster turnaround, better reporting and visibility. Obviously kind of the number 2 and number 3. Fairly low number of you responded that, fewer errors or better capture of early payment discounts are, kind of the key drivers. And that's interesting. It's not uncommon. So let me show you what we got back in the survey data. Lower cost is actually number 3 in this. Faster turnaround time at 29.6% of respondents was actually the number 1 overall benefit. And the second then was reporting and visibility. 16% of survey respondents said, fewer errors. What you'll see later when we get to it is actually a slide that shows there is a significant number of users of this technology that report fewer errors. So just as with last year's survey, there sort of seems to be a discrepancy between the benefit being fewer errors and the reality being that errors are actually driven down pretty considerably. One thing I will point out is that faster turnaround times as a benefit at 29, nearly 30% this year, is up significantly from last year. So last year's data showed that at about 18.3%. I suspect that's a sign of the times, faster visibility, but faster turnaround times being critical to the data that's flowing through the AP operation, both at a tactical level, but we also hear, over and over again at a strategic level for, the controller, the CFO, being able to, provide for accurate and timely accruals, get the books closed, and so on and so forth, cash forecasting and the like. I think increasingly, organizations are turning to the AP department to help them get that data. We asked the question, is there actually a project underway? About 25% of companies said yes, 61% said no, and another 13% said, they weren't certain. These numbers are pretty similar to where they were last year. We asked the question then, too, is if we perceive benefits, and the respondents perceive benefits to automating AP with data capture, what are the barriers? And so before I share the survey findings with you, let me open the poll It's actually the last poll question. I'll launch that poll and get your feedback on if you're considering it or whether you're not actively considering it. Again, the fact that you're on today's call, I think, shows some level of interest, but I'm interested to know, what the barriers are, real and perceived barriers. So let's just wait a few moments, and I will share that data with you again in just a moment as to what the survey respondent population said as well. Okay. So just another moment on that. We'll close the poll. Okay. Great. Thank you. Share that for you. All right. So the dominant response was lack of budget. Not surprising. I think lack of business case, about 15%, lack of suitable solutions, at about 15%. That would suggest that you've actually gone to market and evaluated solutions and just haven't found anything that looks like it would do the trick. Resources, 29%, and then executive sponsorship. So great idea, but nobody willing to stand up for it in your organization. We'll hide that, and I'll show you what the general audience came back with. The majority of respondents to the survey said it was lack of budget, so about 35%. The other, large one was the lack of resources to support the project. Typically what this is, at least in our experiences, there's a perception that it's going to take IT resources, and in some cases it does. It's IT, maybe your business analyst, business resources, but typically it's IT resources. We asked about the business case, so at about 18.4%, that's pretty similar to what you all came back with. Suitable solutions was very low with the respondent population. So you'll see that's about 5%, and yet you all responded, I think, at about 15%, so about 3 times greater. That's an interesting, that to me is interesting. So thank you again for that. This year, we asked a question similar to this last year about actually, what technologies, what vendors are out there in the market space. And I asked the question last year in a way that made the results a little bit more difficult to interpret. So we split it into 2 questions this year, asking the first, which is, which document imaging, scanning solution does your company use? And as you can see, there were many alternatives out there. There are lots in the market to choose from, but we kind of wanted to get a sense for the predominant solutions in the market space. And as you can see, there are a lot of use from companies like Highland, certainly Kofax, and the Ascent Capture platform is very prevalent. There are options from Oracle, from Perceptive, from Captiva, and the likes, but quite a few different solutions to choose from that are available in the market. We actually had other alternate choices in the survey that were not selected. You see those there. Some of these companies have actually gone through name changes, so but pretty good representation. What I did this year, though, was to differentiate between sort of document scanning, batch capture, which you may be familiar with simply for things like archive. We asked the question then as a follow-on to which intelligent data capture or automated data capture solution does your company use? And this is interesting because it really changes the perspective. Number one, there aren't that many solution alternatives out there. Brainware popped to the top of the list, so that's up from last year, nearly 20% of the companies that were surveyed. And then you see the rest of these as well. The thing though that's interesting is 36% of the company that responded to the survey said nothing. So looking for data capture, but nothing in place. What has been the impact of data capture on processing costs? So again, to try and get a sense for the trends. Compared to last year's data, I sort of see an interesting sort of a bifurcated curve here. Think of it like a camel hump. Compared to last year's data, you see here 24% of companies see that the impact, there has been no change, unchanged, 24%. That's up significantly from last year. So, that was up from 14.5%. On the flip side, what you see is there was a big shift to the 25 to 50% and 50 to 75%. So, while the numbers went up in terms of unchanged, they also went up pretty significantly in terms of the impact, in the much higher end, right? So there was either very little impact or a significant impact. We asked about the impact on turnaround times. And so, again, you see about 40% are processing, invoices faster, another 33% 4 to 7 days faster, so on and so forth. So there tends to be a significant impact on turnaround times. In terms of reporting, 41% of the respondents said that reporting has actually gotten much easier. This is the slide that I referenced earlier that says, what is the impact on errors? So 41% said they're unchanged. 53% of the respondents said there are now fewer errors, which shouldn't really come as a surprise, but I think it's a testament to the technology that says, look, people make mistakes, and while there's cost associated and scalability issues, one of the things that you get when you move to automation is consistency of process. And so the impact on errors and the downstream cost of those errors can also be very significant. So right before I open it up for questions, because I recognize we're running up on the top of the hour, we also asked, sort of free form text comments, what were some additional lessons that were learned? And I share a few of these with you just to give you a sense. In terms of this technology, deploy it incrementally. Don't underestimate the time for AP to change. I think with any type of technology, sometimes there's a misperception that the technology is going to fix the problems. I think oftentimes what happens is it helps you identify areas or maybe it exposes sort of latent process issues. But keep in mind, it's going to take time for your staff to change. The technology goes in pretty quickly. It's sometimes the people that hold things back. That's not uncommon at all. So communicate and iterate with that. Create the milestones and push. A lot of times, like I said, you uncover inconsistencies in data, and so if you're moving from a manual process, it's very easy for your manual operators to kind of work around data deficiencies or things that may be set up in the system that would otherwise stop the process. The automation will do it the same way every time, and so it really forces you to transform the process to achieve, the full-on extent of benefits, that you can achieve and the results therein. Staff need training. Typically, fewer errors, faster turnaround mean fewer man hours for FTEs and so forth. You certainly get what you pay for. And, one company said, look, we really should have done this years earlier. And so I think what happens is if you actually go and you look at the vendors in the space, while budget, resources, and a business plan, often become issues where there's sort of the challenges, the barriers, I think what you find is a lot of these things are self-funding. And so through the efficiency gains, you really do create operational change that can basically pay for the solution, less than 12 months. So with that, I want to thank Kimberly and the folks at IFO for running, another very successful survey for us. I appreciate all of the help and all of the work that they did. I want to thank everybody who joined us for the call today, and encourage you, if you or your colleagues again are interested in the survey findings, that you just go to one of the two websites here, download the results, and follow up if you've got additional questions. So thank you for joining today, and we look forward to hosting you on another upcoming webinar.